There is a saying among the starfaring races, one older than the jump drive and colder than the void between galaxies. It goes like this: never judge the size of a heart by the size of the job someone is given to do. The Vor'kesh Empire did not believe in that saying. The Vor'kesh Empire believed in bloodlines, in rank, in the sacred hierarchy of worth that put emperors at the top and something called humans so far at the bottom that most Vor'kesh couldn't be bothered to learn the difference between a human and the mop it pushed. This is the story of how that arrogance nearly cost an empire its heir, and how a janitor named Daniel Reyes, a man nobody on that station could have picked out of a crowd an hour before, ended up standing in the middle of a royal court with alien blood on his hands and a silence in the room so total you could have heard a heart stop beating. Because one almost did. Daniel had been working aboard the Vor'kesh diplomatic station, Trinity's Reach, for 11 months. He mopped floors, he hauled trash, he fixed the occasional jammed door mechanism when the actual maintenance staff couldn't be bothered to show up. It was not glamorous work. It was not even respected work. The Vor'kesh crew called him the sweeper when they called him anything at all, and most of the time they didn't call him anything because looking at him required more attention than they felt he deserved. Daniel didn't mind. Or, rather, he had trained himself not to mind the way a man trains himself to sleep through gunfire. 3 years earlier, he had been someone else entirely. A combat medic attached to a rapid response unit, the kind of unit that got sent in when things had already gone past the point where anyone expected to come home whole. He had pulled 11 people out of a collapsed structure once, working with his hands in the dark for 6 hours, while a building groaned above him like it was deciding whether to finish the job. He had lost exactly 1 patient in 4 years of service, and that loss had a name, and that name still visited him some nights when the station's artificial gravity hummed at just the wrong frequency and reminded him of a generator that had failed at the worst possible moment. After that, he had left the service. Not with medals, though, he had those too, shoved in a box somewhere on Earth. He had left because there is a kind of exhaustion that doesn't heal with rest, a bone-deep weariness of being the one who is supposed to fix the unfixable. And he had wanted, more than anything, a job where the stakes were small. A job where the worst thing that could happen was a flooded corridor. So he became a janitor on a space station full of aliens who didn't know his name. And for 11 months it worked. He kept his head down. He did his job well, because that was the only kind of person he knew how to be. He went to sleep without dreaming mostly, and he told himself that this was enough. Then Princess Selene of Ashari got sick. She was 6 years old by human reckoning, though the Vor'kesh measured age differently, in something closer to seasons of a moon Daniel had never seen. She was the only daughter of Queen Isari of Ashari, ruler of the Vor'kesh Second Dominion, and, by extension, the highest authority on Trinity's Reach during the diplomatic summit that had brought half the station's population there in the first place. Selene had collapsed during a garden ceremony 3 weeks prior, folding to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut, and she had not stood on her own since. The Vor'kesh had brought in healers, not 1 or 2, 9 of them, each summoned from a different world, each carrying credentials and reputations that would have made lesser physicians weep with envy. Daniel had seen them come and go through the medical wing while he emptied waste bins and mopped up the spilled solutions of failed treatments. He watched their faces change over 3 weeks, watched confidence curdle into confusion, and then into something like fear, because Vor'kesh healers did not fail. Their biology was ancient, well documented, thoroughly understood after millennia of study. There was no reason for a 6-year-old girl to be dying of something no scan could name, but she was dying. Daniel could see it in the way the medical staff moved when they thought no one who mattered was watching. He could see it in the particular quality of silence that settled over the corridor outside her chamber. The kind of silence he remembered from field hospitals, the kind that meant everyone had quietly agreed not to say the word that was sitting in all their mouths. He kept his head down. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had left that life behind, and he had good reasons for leaving it. Reasons that lived behind his ribs and ached on bad nights, and a man was allowed to protect himself from wounds that had already scarred over once. Then came the night. Everything changed. And it changed because Daniel Reyes was standing in the wrong hallway with a mop in his hand, close enough to a set of doors that weren't quite sealed to hear something he was never meant to hear. He had been cleaning the observation corridor outside the Royal Medical Suite, a long curved hall of dark glass that looked out over the slow wheel of stars beyond the station's hall. It was late by station time, the lighting dimmed to its nocturnal setting, and Daniel worked alone, the way he preferred it. He heard voices before he saw anyone. One voice in particular, low and cracking, in a way that didn't match the composed, regal tone Daniel had heard Queen Asaria use in every public appearance he'd witnessed. She was crying. Not performing grief for an audience the way rulers sometimes do, but actually crying. The kind of sound that comes out of a person when they've stopped trying to hold it together because there's no one left to perform for. Daniel froze against the wall, mop suspended, not out of curiosity, but out of the old instinct that told him some moments were too raw to interrupt. "There is nothing left to try," the Queen said, and her voice broke on the last word. 9 healers, 9 of the finest minds in the Dominion, and not one of them can tell me why my daughter is dying in front of me. I have exhausted every option. I have humiliated myself before courts that already think we are weak. I have prayed to gods I stopped believing in when I was younger than she is now. A second voice answered, gentler, belonging to an older Vor'kesh male Daniel recognized as Chancellor Threll, the Queen's closest advisor. "Your Majesty, there may yet be options among the outer colonies. Healers we have not. I have sent for them all, Threll." The Queen's voice cracked further. "Do you understand? All of them. There's no one left to summon. I have done everything a queen can do, and it was not enough. And now I must go sit beside my daughter and watch her fade, because I have run out of miracles to buy." Daniel stood very still in the dim corridor, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. He heard the Queen say, quieter now, almost to herself, "I have given up. May the ancestors forgive me, but I have given up hope. There is nothing more that can be done." And Daniel, a man who had spent 3 years teaching himself not to care about things bigger than a flooded corridor, felt something old and familiar stir awake in the dark behind his ribs. He thought about the 11 people he had pulled from that collapsed building. He thought about the one he hadn't been able to save and the particular way that failure had carved itself into him, and how he had told himself afterward that the weight of it was too much to carry twice. He thought about a 6-year-old girl he had never met, fading behind a set of doors guarded by 9 failed miracles, and a mother who had run out of them. He set down his mop. It was such a small motion, the setting down of a mop. But there are moments in every life that pivot on gestures exactly that small. Daniel walked toward the medbay entrance, and a guard, a towering Vor'kesh soldier in ceremonial plating, stepped in front of him with the bored contempt of someone swatting an insect. "This area is restricted, sweeper," the guard said. "Return to your duties." "I need to see the girl," Daniel said. The guard actually laughed, a short bark of disbelief. "You need to see the princess. The human janitor needs to see the princess." He said it like he was trying the words out to see if they made any more sense. "The second time they didn't. Go back to your mop before I have you removed from this station entirely." Daniel did not raise his voice. He did not argue or plead or try to explain himself, because he had learned long ago that explaining yourself to someone who has already decided you don't matter is a waste of breath better spent elsewhere. He said, "Get your queen. Tell her the janitor knows something about her daughter's illness. Tell her, I'll wait exactly 1 minute, and then I go back to my mop, and you can explain to her later why you turned away the one lid she didn't already exhaust." Something in his tone made the guard hesitate. Not respect. Not yet. Just enough uncertainty to crack the door open. The guard disappeared inside. 10 seconds passed. 20. Daniel counted them the way he used to count seconds, under fire, an old habit that never quite left him, a way of making time behave when everything else refused to. At 43 seconds the doors opened, and Queen Asaria Vashari stood in them herself, her face raw and unroyal, eyes rimmed red, looking at Daniel with an expression that was less hope than the ghost of hope. the kind that has been burned so many times it approaches a new possibility with something close to dread. "You are the sweeper," she said. It was not a question. It was disbelief translated into words. "Daniel Reyes," he said. "I used to be a combat medic. Before this job, I've spent 11 months cleaning up after your medical staff, and I've watched them treat your daughter for 3 weeks. I think I might know what they're missing." The Queen stared at him for a long moment, and Daniel watched something war behind her eyes. Pride and grief in the particular, specific desperation of a parent who has been told there is nothing left to try, now confronted with the possibility that there might be one more thing after all, held out by the least likely hands in the entire station. "Chancellor Threll," she said finally without looking away from Daniel. "Let him in." The medical suite was large, sterile, lit in the cool white the Vor'kesh preferred for their healing spaces, and it was crowded despite the late hour. All 9 healers were present, along with a handful of aides, and every one of them turned to stare at Daniel as he walked in behind the Queen, still in his gray janitor's coveralls, still smelling faintly of cleaning solution. The disbelief in the room was almost a physical pressure. "Your Majesty," said the eldest of the healers, a thin, silver-scaled Vor'kesh named Fessa Orn, whose reputation Daniel had overheard aides discussing with something close to reverence. "This is the sanitation worker. Surely you don't mean to let him." "I mean to let him," the Queen said, and something in her tone closed the conversation before it could open further. "He says he knows something. You have all had 3 weeks. He can have 3 minutes." Daniel walked past the healers, toward the bed at the center of the room, and there she was. Princess Solena Vashiri, 6 years old, small even for her age, her skin the pale violet gray of her people, gone almost translucent at the edges. Dark hollows carved beneath eyes that fluttered without fully opening. Tubes and monitoring lines ran from her thin arms to machines Daniel didn't recognize, machines that beeped in a rhythm too slow, too uneven, the rhythm of a body running out of road. He had seen that rhythm before. Different species, different machines, same fundamental arithmetic of a body. Giving up. And, "What are her symptoms?" Daniel asked, not looking away from the girl, his voice slipping without effort into the flat clinical cadence he hadn't used in 3 years, but had apparently never fully forgotten. "In order from the beginning." Fessa Orn bristled visibly at being addressed this way by a janitor, but the Queen's eyes were on her, and after a moment the healer answered, clipped and precise. "Progressive, muscular, weakness, irregular, cardiac rhythm, declining neural response. We have run every diagnostic available to us. Her biochemistry shows no pathogen, no toxin, no structural abnormality. By every measure we possess, she should be healthy. But she's not," Daniel said. "No," Fessa Orn admitted, and there was real anguish in the admission, the anguish of a healer who has failed. The one patient failure was never supposed to touch. She is not. Daniel moved closer to the bed, and he did something none of the 9 healers had apparently thought to do in 3 weeks of increasingly desperate treatment. He knelt down to the girl's eye level, and he looked, not at a monitor, not at a readout, but at her. At the specific, individual details of a specific, individual child. He noticed the faint discoloration at the inside of her wrist, almost hidden beneath the medical tape holding an IV line in place. "How long has this been here?" he asked, gently peeling back the tape, revealing a small bruised patch of skin, no larger than a coin, mottled in a color that didn't quite match the rest of her. The healers crowded closer, and their faces, one by one, went through a transformation, confusion, sliding into something like dawning horror. "That was not present in our scans," Fessa Orn said slowly. "It wouldn't be," Daniel said. "It's not internal, it's a contact reaction. Something on her skin, something she's been in repeated contact with, that's building up in her system, slowly enough, that it wouldn't show on a standard toxicology screen, unless you were specifically looking for cumulative, topical exposure instead of acute poisoning." He looked up at the Queen. "Has anything changed in the last month? Any new fabric? Any new plant brought into her chambers? Any gift? Anything new she's been wearing or touching or sleeping near?" The Queen's face went very still. "The garden," she said. "The ceremonial garden where she collapsed. It was planted new for the summit. Flowers from the outer colonies meant as a gesture of unity with the delegations. Has anyone tested the flowers?" Daniel asked. Silence answered him. 9 of the finest healers in the Dominion, and not one of them had thought to test the flowers, because flowers were beneath their attention, because the answer to a mystery involving a princess had to be complicated, had to be worthy of their expertise, and it had never occurred to a single one of them that the answer might be something as simple, as mundane as a plant. Daniel had thought to look because he had spent 3 years learning that the answer to why a person is dying is very often unglamorous. Boots that don't fit right and cause an infection nobody notices until it's septic. Water that looks clean and isn't. A flower. Nobody thought to question because who would suspect a flower? "I need a sample of whatever's growing in that garden," Daniel said. "And I need to know what antihistamine compounds you have on hand because if I'm right, this isn't an illness at all. It's an allergic reaction, cumulative and severe. And her body has been fighting a war against something you've been letting her sleep 3 meters away from every single night." The room exploded into motion. Aides ran for samples. Fessa Orn, to her credit, did not waste time on pride once the possibility took root, moving immediately to prepare compounds, barking orders with the same precision she'd have used on any confirmed diagnosis. The Queen stood frozen at the foot of the bed, one hand pressed to her mouth, watching a theory take shape that had not existed 20 minutes earlier. The garden sample came back within the hour, rushed through analysis by a lab technician who had never moved faster in her professional life. A specific pollen compound from a flower called the Varan bloom, imported from a colony world 3 systems away, chosen for the ceremony because of its striking blue color and its supposed universal safety across known biologies. Not universal enough, as it turned out. Not for a 6-year-old Vor'kesh girl, whose particular genetic makeup, some rare recessive trait inherited from her father's side, reacted to a specific protein in the bloom's pollen the way certain humans reacted to peanuts. Not with a sudden dramatic reaction, but with something slower, subtler. A body waging a quiet losing war against constant low-level exposure, 3 weeks of sleeping in a room that had been, without anyone's knowledge or intent, slowly poisoning her. "She needs to be moved from that wing immediately," Daniel said. "Away from anything containing that pollen. Every surface, every piece of fabric needs to be cleaned or replaced. And she needs the antihistamine compound now. Not gradually now because her system's been compensating for 3 weeks and it's running out of reserves." Fessa Orn administered the compound herself, hands steadier than Daniel expected from someone who had just watched a janitor upend 3 weeks of failed expertise in under an hour. The room went very quiet, the particular quiet of people watching a monitor, waiting for a number to change, waiting for a rhythm to shift. It took 4 minutes. The uneven beeping of the cardiac monitor, that slow, dragging arrhythmia that had haunted the room for 3 weeks, began gradually to even out, not dramatically. Not with fireworks or triumphant music, just a slow, steady correction, beat by beat, towards something that sounded, for the first time in weeks, like a healthy heart doing what a healthy heart is supposed to do. Princess Selena's eyes fluttered, opened halfway and focused, blearily, on the ceiling above her. "Mother," she said, in a voice thinner than paper, but present, awake, herself. Queen Isaria Visheri, ruler of the Second Dominion, a woman who had stood before hostile courts and unflinching enemy fleets without breaking composure, made a sound Daniel had only ever heard from mothers in field hospitals, a sound with no dignity left in it at all, pure relief-given voice, and she was at her daughter's side in a single stride, gathering the girl's thin hand in both of hers. "I'm here," the Queen said over and over, like the words themselves were a treatment. "I'm here. I'm here." Daniel stepped back from the bed, because that moment did not belong to him, and he had learned a long time ago that the job of the person who fixes things is to get out of the way once the fixing is done. He didn't get very far. The 9 healers were staring at him, Chancellor Threll was staring at him. The guards at the door, the aides. Everyone in that room who had spent 3 weeks failing to save this child was staring at the human janitor standing quietly by the door in his gray coveralls. And the silence that followed was the kind that changes a room permanently, the kind where everyone present understands, all at once, that something fundamental about how they saw the world had just been proven wrong. Fessa Orn was the first to speak, and her voice, when it came, carried none of its earlier condescension. "How?" she said simply. "How did you see what 9 of us could not?" Daniel considered the question honestly before answering, because it deserved an honest answer. "Because you were looking for something worthy of your training," he said. "Something rare, something complicated, something that would require 9 of the finest healers in the Dominion to diagnose. I wasn't trained the way you were trained. I spent 4 years pulling people out of collapsed buildings and burning vehicles, and in that line of work you learn fast that the thing that kills someone is almost never the impressive thing. It's the small thing nobody thought to check. A splinter, a bad seal on a mask, a flower somebody picked because it looked nice for a ceremony." He looked toward the bed, where the queen still hadn't let go of her daughter's hand. "I wasn't smarter than any of you," he said. "I just wasn't looking for something impressive. I was looking for something true." Queen Assaria finally looked up from her daughter, and the look she gave Daniel was not the look of a queen addressing a janitor. It was the look of a mother addressing the person who had just handed her back her entire world. "You could have said nothing," she said quietly. "You are not required to care what happens in these halls. You clean floors for people who have not troubled themselves to learn your name in 11 months of service. You would have had every reason in the world to stay silent tonight." "I know," Daniel said. "Why didn't you?" Daniel thought about the answer for a long moment, because it mattered to get it right, not for the room, but for himself. "Because I heard you say you'd given up hope," he said, "and I used to be someone who believed giving up wasn't allowed, not while there was still something left to try. I put that belief away for a while. Tonight, I just picked it back up." The queen was quiet for a moment, studying him with an intensity that made several of the aides shift uncomfortably, as though witnessing something too private for an audience. "What is your name?" she asked. "Your full name. I want to know it." "Daniel Reyes. Daniel Reyes," she repeated, like she was setting the words down somewhere permanent. "You will not be cleaning floors on this station again." Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. An old defensive reflex, the instinct of a man who had built a quiet life, specifically so that no one would ever again ask more of him than he could bear to give. "Your Majesty, I appreciate that, but I didn't do this to be rewarded. I did it because it was the right thing to do, and I'd like to go back to my life when she's stable. I'm not looking for a position in your court. I am not offering you a position out of gratitude alone, though the ancestors know you have earned every honor this Dominion can offer," the Queen said. "I am telling you that a man who diagnosed what 9 royal healers could not, in the space of an hour, working from instinct and experience alone, cannot in good conscience be left to mop corridors for the rest of his service contract. That is not a reward, Daniel Reyes. That would simply be waste." Chancellor Threll stepped forward, his earlier skepticism entirely gone, replaced with the careful attentiveness of a man recalculating everything he thought he understood about the world. "Your Majesty, if I may, the Dominion Medical Corps has needed reform for a generation. Our healers are extraordinary, but they are trained within a single framework, a single way of seeing illness. This man sees differently. That difference just saved the heir to the throne." The Queen nodded slowly, still holding her daughter's hand, and Selene, weak but conscious, had turned her head to look at Daniel with the open, unguarded curiosity of a child meeting someone important for the first time. "Are you the one who fixed me?" the girl asked, her voice small but clear. Daniel crossed back to the bed and knelt again, so he was at her eye level instead of looming over her, the way adults so often forgot not to. "I just noticed something everyone else missed," he said. "You did the hard part. You held on." The girl considered this with a serious focus. Small children bring to questions that matter to them. "The flowers made me sick," she said, working it out slowly. "I like the flowers." "I know," Daniel said. It's all right to still like flowers, just not that one, maybe for a while. Something that might have been the ghost of a laugh flickered across the girl's exhausted face, and Daniel felt, for the first time in 3 years, something loosen in his chest that he hadn't fully realized was clenched. Word of what had happened in the Royal Medical Suite did not stay contained to that room, of course. It never does, not on a station full of diplomats and aides and guards who had all watched a human janitor walk in and correct 9 of the Dominion's finest healers in under an hour. By the following morning, the story had traveled through every level of Trinity's reach, growing slightly with each retelling, until Daniel found himself the subject of conversations he overheard in corridors. He was still, out of habit, quietly cleaning. The Vor'kesh healers, to their considerable credit, did not respond to the incident with wounded pride. Fessa Orn sought Daniel out personally the next day, finding him in a supply closet restocking cleaning solution, an image so at odds with the events of the previous night that she stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply processing it. "You are still doing this," she said. "Habits die slow," Daniel said, not looking up from the shelf he was organizing. "The Queen has ordered your reassignment, effective immediately. You are to join the medical corps as a consulting diagnostician with full compensation and standing equivalent to a senior healer." Fessa Orn paused. "I recommended it myself, for what it is worth. I have spent 40 years believing that expertise was the same thing as wisdom. Last night I learned they are not always the same thing at all." Daniel finally straightened, setting down the bottle of solution in his hand. "I appreciate that. Truly. But I've been down that road before, back home. Being the person everyone depends on to fix the unfixable. It cost me more than I want to talk about, and I built this quiet little life specifically so I wouldn't have to be that person anymore. And yet," Fessa Orn said gently, "when a mother said she had given up hope, you set down your mop and walked into a room you had every reason to avoid." Daniel didn't have a ready answer for that. "I am not asking you to become who you were before," the healer continued. "I am asking you to consider that perhaps who you are now, quiet and careful and unwilling to look away from a child in pain, is exactly the person this Dominion needs somewhere in its medical corps, not because you owe us anything, because you are apparently extraordinarily good at this, and the galaxy is short on people who are both extraordinarily good at something and extraordinarily unwilling to abandon someone who needs them." Daniel thought about that for a long time after Fessa Orn left. He thought about it while he finished his shift and while he lay awake that night in his small crew quarters, staring at the ceiling the way he used to stare at ceilings in the months after he left the service, turning old drifts over like stones to see what still lived underneath them. He thought about the one patient he hadn't saved 3 years ago, in the dark, under a groaning building. He thought about a 6-year-old girl who had said, in a voice thin as paper, that she liked the flowers. 2 days later, Queen Isaria Vashari requested a private audience with him, not in the medical wing this time, but in her own quarters, a gesture of respect that Chancellor Threll assured him was almost never extended to anyone outside the highest circles of Vor'kesh nobility. Daniel arrived in his same gray coveralls because he did not own anything else, and the Queen, seated across from him in a room of quiet, understated elegance, did not seem to mind at all. "My daughter asked for you this morning," the Queen said. "She wanted to know if the man who fixed her would come see the garden once it has been replanted. Something without the blue flowers," she specified. "I'd like that," Daniel said, and meant it. "I owe you a debt I do not know how to properly repay," the Queen continued. "I have offered you rank, compensation, a place in my medical corps. Fessa Orn tells me you are hesitant." "It's not that I don't appreciate it," Daniel said. "It's that I know myself. If I take that position, I become the person people call when everything else has failed. That's not a small thing to carry. I carried it once, and it broke something in me that took a long time to even partially mend." The Queen studied him for a long moment. "Then I will not ask you to carry it as a burden," she said. "I will ask you to carry it as you carried it 2 nights ago, quietly, on your own terms. You do not need to become the person you were before. You do not need to accept every case, save every patient, answer every call. I am not asking for a hero, Daniel Reyes. Heroes burn out and break, and I have no interest in breaking the man who saved my daughter. I am asking for a colleague. Someone the medical corps can consult when their 9 best minds have exhausted every conventional answer, and someone who is permitted, always, to say no. Daniel sat with that for a while, turning it over the way he'd turned over every hard decision in his life, slowly, honestly, without rushing toward the answer that would be easiest to give. I'd want it to stay small, he said finally. Not a title people whisper about in corridors. Not a legend, just a job. A job where I help when I can, and where nobody expects me to be more than a man who noticed a bruise nobody else looked for. That, the Queen said, is precisely the job I am offering. Daniel accepted. He did not become a legend overnight, though the story of the janitor who saved the princess did follow him in whispered versions and exaggerated retellings for as long as he remained aboard Threnodi's Reach. He did not seek out further cases, did not position himself as anything other than what he had always quietly been, a careful observer with a habit of noticing what other people's expertise trained them to overlook. But he was there, in the medical wing, 3 days a week, consulting on cases the Dominion's finest minds found themselves stuck on, and more often than the healers cared to admit, the answer he found was small, unglamorous, and true. Princess Selena recovered fully within a month, color returning to her skin, strength returning to her small limbs, and she made good on her request. Daniel visited the replanted garden on a quiet afternoon, 3 weeks after that terrible night, and found her waiting for him near a bed of pale silver flowers that had replaced the blue ones entirely. "These don't make me sick," she announced with the particular pride of a 6-year-old reporting a personal victory. "I checked myself. I made the healers test them 4 times. Sounds thorough," Daniel said. "You're supposed to be thorough," Selene said, echoing, Daniel suspected, something one of the healers had told her in the aftermath, a lesson she had apparently taken very seriously. "Nobody was thorough about the blue ones. That's why I got sick." "That's exactly why," Daniel agreed. Queen Asaria watched the exchange from a short distance away. Arms folded, something soft and unguarded in her expression that Daniel suspected very few people outside her own family had ever been permitted to see. When their eyes met, she offered him a small, genuine nod, the kind exchanged between people who understood each other without needing further words. The Dominion's medical corps did change in the months that followed in ways that outlasted the specific crisis that had prompted them. Fessa Orn instituted new protocols requiring junior healers to spend time training in the mundane, hands-on work of frontline medicine before advancing to specialized study, insisting that expertise without grounding was a liability dressed up as an asset. She credited the change, whenever asked, to a conversation with a human janitor who had reminded her, in the space of a single sentence, that the answer to why someone is dying is very often unglamorous. Daniel never sought credit for any of it. He kept his quarters small, his life quiet, his habits mostly unchanged. He still occasionally picked up a mop, not because anyone required it of him, but because there was something steadying in the simple, honest work of cleaning up a mess with his own 2 hands, something that had nothing to do with life and death, and after 3 years of running from exactly that kind of weight. 2. He had learned he didn't need to run from it entirely. He just needed to carry it differently. On his own terms, in doses, he could survive. He kept a small drawing on the wall of his quarters, given to him by Selene some months later, crayon on rough paper, depicting a stick figure in gray beside a bed of silver flowers, with a shaky, careful inscription beneath it that read, in the girl's still developing grasp of standard script, "The man who noticed." That was the story that mattered most to him, in the end. Not the titles offered, and mostly declined. Not the whispered legend that traveled the station's corridors for months afterward. Not even the gratitude of a queen who had once believed she'd exhausted every possible miracle. Just the plain, quiet truth of it, distilled down to 4 words in a child's careful handwriting. The man who noticed. There's a version of this story that ends with Daniel Reyes ascending to some grand position, becoming the celebrated hero of the Vor'kesh court, his name carved into some monument for future generations to admire. That is not what happened, and Daniel would have found that version faintly embarrassing if anyone had suggested it to him. What actually happened was smaller and truer, and in its own way more remarkable. A grieving mother got her daughter back. A dying girl grew up to plant her own gardens, carefully, checking every flower herself before she let anyone she loved near it. A rigid, proud medical establishment learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that wisdom and expertise are not always the same thing, and that sometimes the person best equipped to save a life is the one nobody thought to ask. And a quiet man, who had once believed his capacity for that particular kind of caring had been used up entirely. 3 years in one collapsed building ago, discovered that it hadn't been used up at all. It had just been resting, waiting for a night when a queen said she had given up hope, and someone standing close enough to hear decided that hope was not yet finished with her. If you enjoyed this story, there are more like it waiting for you. Tales of quiet people who turn out to carry more strength, more skill, and more heart than anyone around them ever expected. Stories where the overlooked become the unforgettable, and where kindness applied at exactly the right moment changes everything. Let me know in the comments what part of Daniel's story stayed with you most. If you like this one, consider subscribing, ringing the notification bell, and sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that the quietest people in the room are often the ones who end up saving it. End first court. Until next time, keep your eyes on the stars and never underestimate the person holding them up.